Okay, let's go with part two. We're going to be talking about culture during the 1950s in this segment. So, the word teenager was actually not particularly common until after World War II. So, we're going to see that suddenly the teenage group is going to be considered separate in terms of their contribution to the economy. We're going to see that there's going to be an increased purchasing power of American youth. Their numbers are obviously growing by the 1950s. We're starting to see that there's definitely an increased number of youth in the US, and by the time you get to the late 1950s, they're starting to enter their teenage years. Teenagers are treated as a special part of the economic community, and their patterns of consumerism are going to really challenge the market because they're very, very different from what adults are purchasing. And we're also going to see that the radio is going to start to transition from something that was used more for wartime communication to a music-dominated medium. Music definitely reflected interesting race relations during the 1950s. In terms of rock and roll, you're going to see that some record labels are going to produce artists that they consider a separate genre. They call them R&B or rhythm and blues. Some of them call them race music or soul music. So in the 50s, sometimes black artists were actually considered on a completely different chart than white artists. Also, some people found that the music of some artists was a little bit edgier than others and may not transition into a mainstream audience. So I played you these in class, so I'm not going to play them in the video, but we looked at the same song. We looked at Tutti Frutti performed by two different artists, right? Little Richard has more provocative lyrics. He sings about relationships with multiple women. He talks about how they are rocking different places, and we discussed in class how rock and roll actually was sometimes used as a euphemism for sex, right? And also his voice, just in general, he's jumping octaves, he's more raspy. Little Richard even wore makeup sometimes, so he's seen as a little bit more flamboyant. So the white record labels decided to get Pat Boone to record a white version of the song. It's like an octave lower. He doesn't have that same sort of raspy vocal quality, and he also changes the lyrics to make his relationship with women that he's singing about seem much more wholesome. Other things about race and music, we're going to see that there were some black artists like Chuck Berry, for example, who were promoted on the mainstream. There was one Cleveland disc jockey. His name was Alan Freed. He made his name by promoting black artists. And also when Elvis took the stage, it's important for us to realize that Elvis actually gained notoriety partly because he sang a lot of songs that were originally written by black artists, including Hound Dog, by the way. And so in some ways, some people saw him as the first rock and roll musician, partly because he was able to adapt music that was traditionally performed by a black demographic and sort of whitewashed it. Elvis, by the way, grew up in public sector housing and essentially grew up in a neighborhood that was mostly populated by black people. So that's also one of the reasons why he developed the sound that he did. Rock and roll was seen as a uniting force for teenagers. It gave them a feeling of ownership over music and helped them identify an identity that was uniquely their own, right? And the artists that we're looking at here, this is Elvis, obviously. This is Chuck Berry, and this is Buddy Holly, who was also a very famous white performer of his day, but he died tragically in a plane crash, so he wasn't around forever. In terms of youth culture, we also see that, again, there's sort of this divide there. Some people sort of still have the desire to become adults very quickly, and start to develop financial security. But then you also have this increased sense of rebellion among the youth culture. People who are not really ready to fully grow up. And James Dean was one of the best representations of that continued youthful rebelliousness. So you see that in some ways this reflects adults, observers, and their anxiety associated with rock and roll, because they feel like it unleashes youthful passions, right? And it's sort of dangerous in terms of, just getting the youth to conform, to settle down, to behave. There was a link between rock and roll and juvenile delinquency. Even congressional hearings debated the influence of rock and roll and whether it was sort of corrupting that generation's youth. So, in terms of television, we also talked about how this is a very important contribution to culture. It is increasingly going to replace radio as a source of entertainment. Radio sort of set a precedent for people already getting hooked on certain programs. Because radio had already set a precedent, there was a smoother transition into TV as the dominant medium for entertainment. So a lot of the earliest programs were still in the same kind of format. They were essentially sitcoms for the radio, and so all they did was adapt them to television. The idea was that you could sort of catch on without watching the previous episodes. A lot of the programs talked about, just regular families, right? Before, when radio came out, some sitcoms still focused on more urban and ethnic families, but by the 1950s, classic sitcoms like Leave It to Beaver, for example, emphasized idealized white suburban communities. You do see that also there's an increased emphasis on Western films, and some of this reflects a Cold War mentality because there's the general sense of the hero, the rugged individual, and to a certain extent the Indians he is fighting against are a metaphor for Russian communists. You do see that most TV shows don't actually make any direct reference to communism. The idea is to completely deny its existence. But of course, we do see that some important congressional hearings are going to start getting televised in the 1950s. And also there's going to be an increased attention to using television for presidential and other political campaigns. Like Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidential run was pretty heavily publicized. The last slide in this video, we're going to talk about the Beatnik generation. Basically, again, this highlights some sense of rebelliousness among the youth generation. There was partly because people were increasing their purchasing power. There was this growing gap between the youth and the adulthood. You're going to see that there's going to be a growing number of people who start to criticize mainstream culture. So basically the Beatniks start to criticize the sense of conformity, and they start to live a life that is comprised of more spontaneity. A lot of them listen to jazz. They are very overt in terms of their sexuality. They refuse to settle down and marry. They tend to be more open about drug use, and they also tend to sort of portray themselves as outcasts to the general American paradigm. So they're not getting full-time jobs and settling down and getting married, in other words. You're going to see that by the late 1950s, the mass media starts to really trivialize the Beatnik generation and just sort of talking about them as alienated men and women who wear sunglasses and berets and sort of try to shortchange them. But really, the Beatnik generation sort of foreshadows the much more widespread youth rebellion in the 1960s. And again, a very good example, if you wanted to talk about the Beatnik generation more specifically, you could talk about Jack Kerouac's On the Road, where he does this road trip, across the country. And obviously, he's not settling down, establishing, permanent career. And he's meeting many different people along the way. And sometimes he's engaged in very debaucherous behavior. And On the Road reads a little bit more in stream of consciousness form, which also sort of emphasizes the refusal to conform to the normal style of writing. All right, so that is the culture of the 1950s video. We'll talk about foreign policy next. Thanks.